Born Edgar Poe in Boston, Massachusetts, United States, on January 19, 1809, the second child of English-born actress Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins Poe and actor David Poe Jr. He had an elder brother, William Henry Leonard Poe, and a younger sister, Rosalie Poe. His father abandoned their family in 1810, and his mother died a year later from pulmonary tuberculosis. Poe was then taken into the home of John Allan, a successful Scottish merchant in Richmond, Virginia. The Allans served as a foster family and gave him the name Edgar Allan Poe, though he never formally adopted it. The family sailed to Britain in 1815, and Poe attended a grammar school for a short period in Irving, Scotland, before rejoining the family in London in 1816. Poe moved with the Allans back to Richmond, Virginia in 1820. Poe may have become engaged to Sarah Elmira Royster before he registered at the University of Virginia in February 1826 to study ancient and modern languages. During his time there, Poe lost touch with Sarah, estranged from his foster family, and also became estranged from his foster father over gambling debts. Poe gave up on the university after a year, not feeling welcome in Richmond, especially when he learned that his sweetheart Sarah had married. He traveled to Boston in April 1827, sustaining himself with odd jobs as a clerk and a newspaper writer. Poe was unable to support himself, so he enlisted in the United States Army as a private on May 27, 1827, using the name Edgar A. Perry. He claimed that he was 22 years old, even though he was 18. He first served at Fort Independence in Boston Harbor for $5 a month. That same year, he released his first book, a 40-page collection of poetry entitled Tamerlane and Other Poems, attributed with the byline by a Bostonian. Only 50 copies were printed, and the book received virtually no attention. Poe's regiment was posted to Fort Moultrie in Charleston, South Carolina, and traveled by ship on the brig Waltham. On November 8, 1827, Poe was promoted to artificer, an enlisted tradesman who prepared shells for artillery, and had his monthly pay doubled. He served for 2 years and attained the rank of sergeant major for artillery. He then sought to end his 5-year enlistment early. He revealed his real name and his circumstances to the commanding officer. Poe finally was discharged on April 15, 1829. Before entering West Point, Poe moved back to Baltimore, Maryland for a time to stay with his widowed aunt Mary Clem, her daughter Virginia Eliza Clem, his brother Henry, and his grandmother. Meanwhile, Poe published his second book, Arabesque, Tamerlane, and Minor Poems, in Baltimore in 1829. Poe traveled to West Point as a cadet on July 1, 1830. In October 1830, Poe decided to leave West Point by purposely getting court-martialed. On February 8, 1831, he was tried for gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders for refusing to attend formations, classes, and church. Poe tactically pleaded not guilty to induced dismissal, knowing that he would be found guilty. He left for New York in February 1831 and released a third volume of poems simply titled Poems. The book was financed with help from his fellow cadets at West Point, many of whom donated 75 cents to the cause, raising a total of $170. It was printed, labeled as second edition. The book once again reprinted the long poems Tamerlane and Arabesque, but also 6 previously unpublished poems, including early versions of To Helen, Israfel, and The City in the Sea. After his brother's death, Poe began more earnest attempts to start his career as a writer. He chose a difficult time in American publishing to do so. He was the first well-known American to try to live by writing alone and was hampered by the lack of an international copyright law. Publishers often produced unauthorized copies of British works rather than paying for new work by Americans. Throughout his attempts to live as a writer, Poe repeatedly had to resort to humiliating pleas for money and other assistance. After his early attempts at poetry, Poe had turned his attention to prose. He placed a few stories with a Philadelphia publication and began work on his only drama, Politian. Returning to Baltimore, Maryland, Poe obtained a license to marry his cousin Virginia on September 22, 1835. He was 26 and she was 13. The narrative of author Gordon Pym of Nantucket was published and widely reviewed in 1838. In the summer of 1839, Poe became assistant editor of Burton's Gentleman magazine. He published numerous articles, stories, and reviews, enhancing his reputation as a trenchant critic which he had established at the Southern Literary Messenger. Also in 1839, the collection Tales of the Grotesque in Arabesque was published in 2 volumes, though he made little money from it and it received mixed reviews. Poe Poe left Burton's after about a year and found a position as assistant at Graham's magazine. In June 1840, Poe announced his intentions to start his own journal called The Stylus. Originally, Poe intended to call the journal The Pen, as it would have been based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The journal was never produced. Around this time, he attempted to secure a position with the Tyler administration, claiming that he was a member of the Whig Party. He hoped to be appointed to the Custom House in Philadelphia with help from President Tyler's son Robert, an acquaintance of Poe's friend. Poe failed to show up for a meeting, claiming to have been sick. Though he promised an appointment, all positions were filled by others. One evening in January 1842, Virginia showed the first signs of consumption, now known as tuberculosis, while singing and playing the piano. Poe described it as breaking a blood vessel in her throat. She only partially recovered. Poe began to drink more heavily under the stress of Virginia's illness. He left Graham's and attempted to find a new position, for a time angling for a government post. He returned to New York, where he worked briefly at the Evening Mirror before becoming editor of the Broadway Journal and later sole owner. There he alienated himself from other writers by publicly accusing Henry Wadsworth Longfellow of plagiarism, though Longfellow never responded. On January 29, 1845, his poem The Raven appeared in the Evening Mirror and became a popular sensation. It made Poe a household name almost instantly, though he was paid only $9 for its publication. The Broadway Journal failed in 1846. Poe moved to a cottage in Fordham, New York, in what is now the Bronx. That home is known today as the Poe Cottage, where he befriended the Jesuits at St. John's College nearby. Virginia died there on January 30th, 1847. Biographers and critics often suggest that Poe's frequent theme of the death of a beautiful woman stems from the repeated loss of women throughout his life, including his wife. Poe was increasingly unstable after his wife's death. He attempted to court poet Sarah Helen Whitman, who lived in Providence, Rhode Island. Their engagement failed. Poe then returned to Richmond and resumed a relationship with his childhood sweetheart, Sarah Elmira Royster. On October 3, 1849, Poe was found delirious, in great distress, and in need of immediate assistance, according to Joseph W. Walker, who found him. He was taken to the Washington Medical College, where he died on Sunday, October 7, 1849, at 5 a.m. Poe was never coherent long enough to explain how he came to be in his dire condition, and oddly, he was wearing clothes that were not his own. He is said to have been repeatedly calling out the name Reynolds on the night before his death, though it is unclear to whom he was referring. Some sources say that Poe's final words were, "Lord, help my poor soul." All medical records have been lost, including his death certificate. Newspapers at the time reported Poe's death as congestion of the brain or cerebral inflammation, common euphemisms for deaths from disruptible causes such as alcoholism. The actual cause of death remains a mystery. Speculation has included delirium tremens, heart disease, epilepsy, syphilis, meningeal inflammation, cholera, and even rabies. The day that Edgar Allan Poe was buried, a long obituary appeared in the New York Tribune, signed Ludwig. It was soon published throughout the country. The piece began, "Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it." Ludwig was soon identified as Rufus Wilmot Griswold, an editor, critic, and anthologist who had borne a grudge against Poe. Griswold attempted to destroy his enemy's reputation after his death. Griswold depicted Poe as a depraved, drunken, drug-addled madman and included Poe's letters as evidence. Many of his claims were either lies or distorted half-truths. For example, it is now known that Poe was not a drug addict. Griswold's book was denounced by those who knew Poe well, but it became a popularly accepted one. Letters that Griswold presented as proof of his depiction of Poe were later revealed as forgeries. Considering that you are watching a video about Edgar Allan Poe only means one thing: Rufus failed at destroying Poe's reputation. After all, I'm not going to be making a video about Rufus Griswold, so yeah, he failed. Edgar Allan Poe's best-known fiction works are Gothic, a genre that he followed to appease the public tastes. His most recurring themes deal with the questions of death, including its physical signs, the effects of decomposition, concerns of premature burial, the reanimation of the dead, and mourning. Beyond horror, Poe also wrote satires, humor tales, and hoaxes. For comic effect, he used irony and ludicrous extravagance, often in an attempt to liberate the reader from cultural conformity. Poe also reinvented science fiction, responding in his writing to emergent technologies such as hot air balloons in The Balloon Hoax. Poe wrote much of his work using themes aimed specifically at mass-marketed tastes. To that end, his fiction also included elements of popular pseudosciences. Poe was also known as a writer of fiction and became one of the first American authors of the 19th century to become more popular in Europe than in the United States. Poe is particularly respected in France, in part due to early translations by Charles Baudelaire. Baudelaire's translations became definitive renditions of Poe's work throughout Europe. Poe had a keen interest in cryptography. In July 1841, Poe had published an essay called A Few Words on Secret Writing in Graham's Magazine. Capitalizing on public interest in the topic, he wrote The Gold Bug, incorporating ciphers as an essential part of the story. Poe had an influence on cryptography beyond increasing public interest during his lifetime. William Friedman, America's foremost cryptographist, was heavily influenced by Poe. He later put to use in deciphering Japan's Purple Code during World War II. The historical Edgar Allan Poe has appeared as a fictional character, often representing the mad genius or tormented artist, and exploiting his personal struggles. Many such depictions also blend in with characters from his stories, suggesting that Poe and his characters shared identities. A personal favorite of mine is the film The Raven starring John Cusack. In the film, Poe is enlisted by a detective to help solve a series of murders where the crimes are modeled after Poe's own stories.